Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to folks who are joining us from different parts of the world. Thank you for joining us today. I am Aditya Sharma from E2V Cloud's marketing team. E2V Cloud is an Indian-based accelerated cloud computing platform for all your computing needs. We hope you will enjoy this session and learn a lot from it. Today with us we have Riyaz Walikar, Chief Hacker and Co-founder at Kloudle. Kloudle is a cloud security SaaS product built for SaaS engineers who want to get security out of the way of being productive. Riyaz will talk about how complex systems like Kubernetes environments become insecure and how attackers use tools and technique to hack them. And well, what are some of the things you can do to secure your cluster? Feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A section during the session, and Riyaz will pick them up as we move. With that, let's move to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Aditya, for the warm welcome and the introduction. In today's webinar, I'm going to talk about and show some examples of hacker tactics, techniques, and procedures that can be used to break into Kubernetes. Right, and it doesn't matter whether Kubernetes is standalone or running on EKS or GKE or even the platform that E2E networks have. They have their own Kubernetes as a service now. Right, the webinar is from the perspective of an attacker, because an attacker's approach to Kubernetes security. That's the language I'm most comfortable with. Been doing this for 15 years now, right? And folks, I'm using two monitors, so I'm going to be looking either way. So don't think I'm going nuts. But I'm just looking at different screens when I'm talking to you folks. I have a Q&A panel here open and the slides on my left, right? My name is Riyaz Walikar. I'm co-founder and chief hacker at Kloudle. We're building Kloudle for SaaS engineers and infra teams to help detect assets in the cloud, identify misconfigurations in them, and provide remediation guidance to save their time so that they can go back to being productive and focus on the primary task at the time. And with Kloudle, it's as simple as you onboard your cloud account, and it's really straightforward to see what's running, what's misconfigured, what should be prioritized in terms of fixes. And Kloudle also gives you detailed step-by-step guide on how to fix the detected misconfigurations. We have about 400 plus misconfigurations that work within the product now across different cloud providers, right? I have over a decade and a half worth of experience in breaking web apps and mobile apps, networks, wireless, done some hacking with ships and containers as well. Cloud infrastructure, and more recently picked up container and Kubernetes security. I've led product security teams and consulting teams at Citrix and PwC in a past life before moving on to start Kloudle. I've been a speaker at multiple security conferences. I'm an author, trainer, security evangelist. I speak at a lot of community events and I'm really passionate about security on a whole, right? Split the contents of today into three parts, right? We're going to begin by understanding why security is hard for most organizations. Try and see what's the mental model that people use, and teams, especially for complex systems like Kubernetes, and not necessarily only Kubernetes. You can apply what we're going to ask, some of the questions that I've asked out in the world, and you'll see that how you can relate to them even with systems that are cloud-based, right? Not necessarily Kubernetes. Part two, we will cover the primary adversary tactics that attackers use to compromise cluster security. We'll look at the MITRE attack threat matrix and work through examples to see how they manifest in the real world. I've taken the updated version that was published from Microsoft, and we're going to look at the different attacks that can be manifested and pick up examples from the real world for this. We'll end the webinar by looking at some tips and tricks to secure Kubernetes and do a Q&A. Honestly, because my entire life has been focused on breaking things and as focused as an attacker, I do not have a lot of defensive related things, but yeah, over a period of time, I've accumulated some understanding of what could have been corrected so that a cluster could have been secure, right? We cover some of those at the end. Before we begin, let's do a quick poll to get a sense of the kind of cloud provider you folks use. And we've got like some of these 3 or 4 questions throughout the webinar as poll options that will come up with that they will run for you. And you get a minute or so to answer this question. It's anonymous, all of this data. We also have a Q&A section at the bottom of your webinar window. I think, where you should be able to post questions. As I said, focused on security, but I should be able to answer questions around other things around Kubernetes as well, or the cloud in general. Okay, cloud provider poll results coming up. AWS seems to take the most common choice right now. Okay, we'll end the poll at this. We've got AWS as the highest, and Azure coming a close second. Mix of multiple providers, some of you folks. Okay. Let's move on with part one. While building Kloudle, we had a lot of conversation with infra engineers and folks, and even dev teams who've been tasked with infrastructure management and responsibilities within their smaller teams, right? And a lot of startups, a lot of small companies do not have dedicated security teams to deal with security fallouts or even detecting or identifying security misconfigurations, but let alone going and verifying and fixing them, right? You know who you are in the audiences. But when you look at the kind of questions, right, or rather when you look at the kind of mindset that some of these folks have when asked with the question, why, what do you do for security, or why do you not have a proper security process and guidance set up? Some of the answers that I've seen include primary focuses to ensure systems and infrastructure remain up. They do not have a security focus because of this. Some of them have answered, we've got backups, firewalls, and antivirus software that seems to take care of security for all of them. Some of the folks that we spoke to conduct annual assessments and no major security issues were discovered. So they're okay, they're happy at this moment. Some of the folks that I have spoken to use really expensive cloud security software or tools to generate a report for management every week, right? And sometimes that's enough for companies. They want to see a report that's been generated for the management to be happy. Folks have, devs especially, our environment changes too fast to keep up with security trends. So we've just given up on maintaining the security trends around. Some of the folks use latest images for containers on Kubernetes. That seems to take care of security at one tiny corner of the cluster, but not everywhere else. And our public cloud footprint is too small to be noticed by attackers. That's another common one that I've come across. And it's understandable. Security can be hard, right? Especially for teams whose primary function is to ensure day-to-day operations, right? And security enforcement and responsibility can actually occur as unwanted, right? And infra folks and dev folks would want to stay away from a security incident or a security event. While they understand the importance of ensuring security, the headache that comes around with, or rather the time that it takes away from you conducting your primary business operations may actually act as a deterrent. Right. So why are complex systems difficult to secure? And it's kind of rhetorical because complexity creates security issues in a lot of cases. But in my experience, security gaps can arise from, and this is no particular order, but with weaknesses in implementation, misconfigurations with the underlying cloud infrastructure itself. Imagine you have your Kubernetes cluster running on top of EKS on AWS, right? If the AWS account, the IAM roles and role that's attached to the node, for example, or the EKS configuration itself in AWS is set very in a relaxed state, there are going to be misconfigurations that happen within the cloud infrastructure itself. There are definitely going to be vulnerabilities in the code running on top of the implementation, because usually this comes from a different team, right? The people who write the code are a different team in companies, and then the folks who run the ops pipeline are different folks, right? So the code itself may have security issues that, when run on top of the cluster, can create an insecure environment. User privileges, boundary conflicts, authorization issues day in, day out, no RBAC, for example, in a lot of cases. And definitely, we can't do anything about this at this point in time. We can only work around preventing damage that can be caused after a 0 day is found and exploited, right? Poor maintenance and lack of security automation is another case. Lack of security know-how to detect, isolate, remediate, reprovision the infected infra. engineer fatigue. You folks who smaller teams, especially if any one of you are in the audience, you know how difficult it is to ensure the continuity of the business, make sure the apps are running, the servers are running, they're healthy, right? There's no downtime. New things have to be provisioned for teams. So there is going to be engineer fatigue if automation is properly not used, and if you're growing too fast, for example. Yeah. Insufficient tooling, lack of processes to ensure, even if tooling is present, that the tooling is used efficiently. And definitely business prioritization. Most businesses that want to ensure that they're, and it makes sense, right? They want their businesses to grow, not focus on security as much. So understanding what drives the narrative is kind of important at this point in time. Different stakeholders have different responses to the question, what if you got hacked, right? And some of you will resonate with the kind of options I've presented here in the audience. Business continuity is going to get affected if we got hacked, right? And that's what your most important concern is. You could lose customers if their data is exposed, right? The business owner, that might be critical for you. Regulatory and governance related fines, that if you're in a country where regulatory authorities imply or impose fines when there's a data breach, right? You could actually be losing money from the bank. You could lose your job at the end engineers. It's a little brutal, but yes, sometimes if you get hacked, companies do take that decision. Data breach could lead to theft of source code, proprietary data. There's definitely an increased cost in cloud bills, post hack cleanup, forensics. You have to then end up doing an annual VAPT, right? All of this can add to bills and expenses. And loss of compliance status. You cannot no longer have your SOC 2 control emblem or the Norton secure emblem or PCI DSS emblem on your website, right? If your hack has been publicized. For attackers, it's a great moment because given that complex systems can bring in their own security issues, Kubernetes environments, multi-cloud architectures, and even multi-service infrastructure within a cloud can all become difficult to maintain from a security standpoint, right? And it's useful for attackers to find these environments. Attackers use standard processes to detect, identify, and exploit weaknesses. We're going to take a look at that from the point of view of Kubernetes. Most attackers are driven by a purpose. And this is important to understand and remember, folks who are attackers in the audience and defenders as well. You would know, and you would have experienced this. Most attackers are driven by a purpose in attempting to compromise systems. Doesn't matter what system it is. Could be a web app, could be a network, could be an Android app, could be a wireless connection. Doesn't matter. You are essentially trying to attackers data theft for black market sell, right? Steal the data, put up on forums, and this is pretty common. A lot of posts on LinkedIn recently where large companies have been hacked and the data has been posted on underground forums. Compromise info for resource reuse. This is another cool one that I think a lot of folks don't realize, and simply because of the stealthiness that is involved here. Your resources may be compromised by bots, by targeted attackers, to reuse your resources so that the attackers can go do crypto mining, right, or host malware, use your infrastructure as a CNC bot to then go attack and perform denial of service on a different target, right? I recently helped another co-founder colleague with ransomware, right, and they had a MS SQL server running on top of an EC2 instance that was exposed to the internet, and they had a weak password for the MS SQL instance. There was a malware that was able to infect the database, gain access to the underlying operating system using stored command XP CMD shell and stored procedures, and use the permissions that the MS SQL server was running to encrypt files within a local directory, right? So, and then they received a extortion note from these ransomware folks. So, ransomware for extortion, very real. Damage reputation, definitely. Some systems do get crippled simply because the attackers want to damage the reputation. And bug bounty, right? And this is a pretty common. Some of you folks in the audience would be bug bounty hunters, but this is another common attacker profile, right? That they want to attack because they want to create a POC for bug bounty. Let's take a look at some of the ways Kubernetes can be attacked and the ramifications this can have on data and the business in general. I've got another poll up here before we jump into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Do you have a dedicated security team to ensure your cloud assets are secure? Aditya, can you run this, please? just to get a sense of how you folks manage security, right? You have a dedicated team consisting of hackers, defenders, and auditors as well. You have a separate team of hackers, but defenses are usually put in by infrastructure folks and SREs within your teams. The third option is you don't have a separate team at all. Your infra engineers take care of finding, fixing, and cloud security misconfigurations. I'm kind of expecting option 3 to have more of them. And last is security is not a very high priority item for us, so no focus as of now. Let's be honest, in the polls, this is anonymous again. Let's see what we get to. Interesting. Option A and option C seem to have almost equal spread. Okay, it seems that there's an equal distribution, almost an equal distribution of folks who have dedicated teams consisting of hackers, defenders, and auditors as well. You folks have governance folks as well within your teams, which is great. Good to have you folks here. Let's end the poll. All right, let's jump into part 2. I've been doing security for, or rather offensive security for about 15 odd years, and hacked every kind of conceivable system. The mental model that attackers use, right, irrespective of how unstructured they are in the real world, they usually follow a set of tactics to reach their end goal. They may not even be aware that they're using these tactics, right? But these are that when I use the word tactics, you can think of them as milestones or steps that an attacker would take to complete different stages in their attack, right? And each step has various techniques by which the tactic is fulfilled. Okay, depending on the technology being targeted, the tactic may differ, but usually it aligns with initial discovery. Right? An attacker would need to discover what the target environment is. Once the target environment has been discovered, you look at code execution, you look at privilege escalation, there's persistence in terms of wanting to stay in the network a little longer, there's evasion, evidence removal, and there's abuse. You eventually want to achieve a final impact on the environment that you've targeted, right? This is what the MITRE frameworks are built for, and they have matrices created for various technology verticals. They have for Windows, Linux. Please take a look at the site. It's a must-see for folks in the offensive as well as the defensive side if you've not seen this before. It's a globally accessible knowledge base. It's hosted at attack.mitre.org. The threat matrix describes tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs for short, for these technologies, and can be used by both offensive security folks to plan test cases and defenders to identify what attack paths are going to be taken by the bad guys. Right? Microsoft created a similar threat matrix for Kubernetes in 2022. The Kubernetes threat matrix is not hosted on attack.mitre. You'll find it on the Microsoft blog. You can just Google for Kubernetes threat matrix for by Microsoft. And they released an updated version 2021. This is what it looks like, and it's based on the MITRE framework model as well, right? You have looking at this from the attacker's perspective. You have you traverse the columns from my left to right, right? So you go from initial access to impact. An attacker would have to obtain initial access, execute code to gain some foothold, optionally persist if you are a nation state, for example. You want to persist within the network, do far more reconnaissance than what your primary foothold would allow you to. Escalate privileges if you already don't have admin or root within the environment. Optionally evade any defenses that may have been placed within the network. Find more credentials within the environment, discover them so that you can go access other resources. Perform additional discovery, move laterally to other resources. This is interesting. I'm going to show you some examples of how someone who's on a Kubernetes cluster control plane could move down to the cloud control plane and then exit into the cloud, right? So I have an attack for that. Collect images is a new one. Collect images from a private registry. Now that you have access within the cloud where the Kubernetes is running, right? You can use that the access to go pull images from the registry. and eventually complete the attack chain by causing an impact, right? And data destruction, resource hijacking, and denial of service are the impact that you would want to have. Okay, we'll go through each one of these and not each technique as such, but let's take a look at some techniques from each tactic and then see where we reach with the impact, right? The first tactic is initial access, which is application vulnerability from the choices that we had. What you see on screen is a very popular SSRF bug that was disclosed to HackerOne, right? And the URL for that is given in the screen itself, which paid out a $25,000 bounty. It's interesting, and I like personally like this one because using the SSRF, the server-side request forgery, the attacker was able to extract the required files, the metadata required to create a authenticated, Kubernetes exchange, right? So they were able to extract client certificates, the primary key. They were able to extract the secrets and the tokens from the cluster itself, and use that to gain code execution within one of the pods, right? So SSRFs definitely are a problem if you have a Kubernetes cluster that's hosting the application. So, remember the part where I said about how application developers run their code on top of clusters that are managed by two very different teams, right? So this is where code security can lead to insecurities in the cluster itself. This is an initial access. So the attacker still needs to gain access to the cluster. The initial access is an entry point for the attacker. A new technique that is added to the updated version of the MITRE ATT&CK framework for Kubernetes is the expose sensitive interfaces, the green bit at the bottom, right? What you see on screen is a showed in search for Kubernetes dashboard, and I haven't blurred out the victims here simply because this is very easily searchable on the internet, right? If you look for Kubernetes dashboards using Shodan, you'll see a ton of them, and I would recommend that you don't go clicking around, usually simply because some of them are unprotected, right? You'd find a Kubernetes dashboard. Kubernetes dashboard is a dashboard to work with Kubernetes environment. So you can, if you have access to a Kubernetes dashboard, you can actually create your own pods. You can exec into pods. You can take a look at what the node configuration is. You can look at what jobs there are. You can look at secrets. You can manage the entire Kubernetes cluster. Obviously, based on the access that you have, the RBAC access that you have. But it kind of gives you an interface and gives an interface to work with the Kubernetes environment, right? Another exposed sensitive interface is the Kubeflow interface. This also allows you to, this is again found through Shodan itself. You can use Kubeflow to run containers. So any dashboard sort of interface that contains the ability to deploy containers has been included as an initial foothold, initial access technique in the MITRE framework, right? There are a couple of other examples in ViewScope and Apache Nifi also. If these get exposed, the attackers would be able to use this to gain access to the cluster. App vulnerabilities that can be used to make network requests, your SSRFs, your XXEs, your LFIs, your path traversals, right? Your file downloads, because you can then download. Imagine you could simply download the kubeconfig, right, from the server itself. SQL injections, plain RCs, all of these can be used to gain access to the environment variables, files containing credentials, and things like that. Stealing the kubeconfig file via an ongoing attack. Imagine you're a developer and there's a malware running on your system, right? Part of the files that were exfiltrated from your system include, say, the gcloud access token, or your credentials file for AWS, or your kubeconfig that you're hosting and running Kubernetes commands from kubectl commands from your system. And exfiltration of those could give access to the attacker. So initial access tactic works on the premise that the attacker has gained now access to, or rather gained a foothold into the environment. The next is execution. So once you've gained a foothold, you can exec into a container. We're looking at the new container technique under the execution tactic. A new container allows you to gain access to the node if you use host path mounts, for example, or if you if you want to access the environment variables within the cluster, you can exec into a new container. You create a new container, you can browse through the file system itself. Once the ability to interact with the cluster is obtained, either via an exposed dashboard or a kubeconfig file stolen from someone's laptop, or secrets leaked within, like we saw the SSRF example where the secrets were leaked via an application vulnerability, attackers will attempt to gain shell access or run custom code within the cluster, right? With Kubernetes, attackers can also inject a sidecar container to hide their presence within an already running pod. We'll take a look at an example a little later. Rarely but not unheard of, a cluster users may choose to run SSH servers within containers to provide for exec capabilities. Okay, attackers can target this to gain code exec capabilities as well. And this is interesting because imagine you are a cluster administrator, but you want your developers to be able to SSH into, for some reason, you want them to SSH into the pods themselves, to troubleshoot, to debug, for whatever reasons, and you have an SSH server running. The attacker manages to gain access to the SSH key and gain access to the pod itself, and bypassing the control plane itself, bypassing the cluster protections that you have put in place. With persistence, that's the next one. And persistence is a little optional in most cases. Unless you're like a nation state, most folks who are trying to compromise clusters kind of skip the whole persistence and defense evasion. You can be as noisy as possible, given that the target is usually someone who knows that you're going to be attacking. If you're doing an assessment, for example, right? Red teaming, very useful. Persistence with Kubernetes cron jobs. Cron jobs are tasks that sit inside the cluster and can run at particular times that you like. Given a cron job schedule, you can work with cron jobs to trigger a particular set of code at execution at a particular moment in time. And what the code on the left, the YAML file on the left for the cron job, in essentially triggers a reverse shell, right, to an attacker IP address that you've configured, and the screen on the right shows you the reverse shell being caught, and then now you have access, right? Looking at the service account token that's mounted within the cluster, you have access to the service account token, which can then be used to interact with the rest of the cluster. Okay. Persistence, an attacker can persist within the Kubernetes infrastructure, and there are tons of places where they can reside, right? You can add SSH keys to the underlying node, and then you don't have to worry about the Kubernetes configuration at all. You don't have to worry about kubeconfig. You can simply SSH into the node, right? You could create jobs, cron jobs that cause reverse shells to be connected, which you saw as an example. Shadow admins is another pretty cool technique by which attackers persist. They create a shadow admin cluster and a cluster admin role that looks like it's part of the cluster, right? Giving it interesting names to simply evade someone who's actually looking through the cluster roles themselves. Read and reuse secrets and config maps from the cluster. Add a binary backdoor binary to a running container after you gain access by executing into the pod and then adding backdoor binary. Right. Some attackers like to persist in most networks for the thrill of seeing how long it takes. As I said, so for most, it is an optional step. Privilege escalation, and this is universal, right? It doesn't matter what kind of network and system you're targeting. You want to gain additional access. You want to gain additional privileges within your cluster, right? Could be cluster, could be cloud environment, could be Windows host, could be Linux host, doesn't matter. Folks who do who've studied OSCP and who've answered the exam, you understand the realization that it takes. Oh, I have shell access, but this is not enough, and I need to get root. So with Kubernetes, the equivalent is what would be a cluster admin binding, right? You could create a cluster role and bind it to a cluster admin binding so that it gains administrative privileges. Right, in the screenshot below, there's a service account that is being created and a cluster role binding with the cluster role cluster admin being added and the service account being added to the cluster role binding. So when you extract the secret for the service account that is created, the secret, now the token that is being generated, has administrative privileges within the cluster. This is another common one where an attacker would be able to, if they are able to run their own pods, and if the cluster is misconfigured, allowing the node, the cluster to have the ability to run privileged containers, an attacker could simply run a node access YAML, for example, a simple Ubuntu pod that gives them access to the underlying host via the host path mount. Right? If you look at on the left side, the YAML description, you notice that there's a host fs volume whose host path is slash, right? It's root, and it's being mounted in node root, right, on the pod. So when this is run, let me see if I have this running. That node access. Yeah, so I have it running here. If you look at this, this is the node access YAML, right? I could okay, let me see my so executing into the pod. Right now, I'm in the pod. I don't have access to Docker. I don't have access to kubectl, right? But because I'm in the pod and there's a host pod that is mounted, I could ch root e path, right? So now what I have done is I've escaped into the underlying node, and I will now have, oops, excuse my typos. This is right. So the what just happened here was using the host path mount, a pretty common thing that most people do, and very easy to prevent as well, by restricting and adding pod security, the admission controller, preventing pods from being able to create any pods, or rather the API server from preventing API server from creating the pods that have a host path mount that can potentially escalate into a full pod to host escape, right? So what you have here is the screenshot shows you the same commands that I ran. Privilege escalation can some of the ways by which an attacker can escalate privileges regardless of what environment. And we're looking at, as I said at the beginning, we're going to talk about Kubernetes across different providers as well as standalone, right? Reading secrets, tokens, or credentials from application configuration, that's a way. Imagine you're on a network and you find a resource. You'd want to go through common files, configuration files to find those credentials that would allow you to go to another host, right, or find another resource. For managed Kubernetes on AWS, GCP, or Azure, or even the way E2E networks have their Kubernetes service, a service token account mapped to the IAM of the platform is tied to the cluster as well, right? This is usually accessible as a mount point within the pod, the where service account token file path that you saw earlier. Detecting which pods are running as privileged pods and then using exec to gain access to those pods, and then from there moving on to the underlying node if possible by doing a Docker inspect on or pod inspect with kubectl, looking at the running pods within the environment would give you an idea of which one is a privileged pod, right? Usually Calico or any of these network providers, core DNS or network providers, they usually run in privileged mode. So you can take a look at see if any of them are exploitable. Accessing the metadata endpoints is one of my favorite ones. Accessing the metadata endpoints to read IAM credentials or service account tokens with Google Cloud, for example. And let's see if we can do a demo of this as well. Or environment variables simply to gain higher privilege credential material. And this is interesting because you imagine you are right now in a pod, you're inside a node, you're on a pod, and you have no idea if the cluster environment is running within a cloud environment, right? It's abstract, it's transparent to you. For you as a user, as an attacker, you've managed to gain access to a pod. As a user of the system, you are accessing a web application that's running on a particular URL and IP address. The entire environment can be set up in such a way you may have, let's not talk about even EKS or AKS. Imagine you have a single two node cluster running on top of virtual machines that are hosted on the cloud, right? Each of these machines themselves could be misconfigured, allowing if there's a way the attacker from the pod can gain access to the node themselves. And now they are essentially inside the virtual machine, right? Which is what the shell gave me access to. I moved from being into the cluster now into the pod, into the node, right? Once I'm into the node, and if I can access the instance metadata, if it was being blocked while I was in the pod, right, that could give you additional access within the cloud. You're essentially escaping out into the cloud environment, right? We'll see if we can do a demo of that as well. So host path mount and cluster admin binding, common privilege escalation techniques for Kubernetes. Defense evasion, I'm not a big fan of this, but simply because most people don't practice defense evasion unless you're like a nation state, as I keep saying. Look at the pod on the left. If you notice the pod description on the left, if you notice the name of the pod, it's core DNS -74 FF da da da. The interesting thing is when you apply the pod description and when you run the pod, you are essentially running this in the namespace kube system, which is where all your primary Kubernetes sensitive, Kubernetes specific configuration, Kubernetes specific pods are run with their own configurations. Core DNS has other pods. Now, if you look at this screenshot on the right, you wouldn't be able to identify by simply looking at the name of the pods which one of them is malicious. I mean, there's a way. If you look at the age, for example, you can see that one of them was started 3 seconds ago, the rest was 37 days ago when the cluster was created, right? But at first glance, you'd have to do a little more digging to figure out. But at first glance, pod name similarity is a way to evade any defenses. The defense being here, you as an active administrator looking through the Kubernetes environment. Okay. As privilege increases within the cluster, attackers usually find novel ways to remove their traces and remain undetected. Clearing logs by accessing var logs pods directory, so that if you're going to be doing forensic investigation or if you're going to be looking at actively monitoring logs within the cluster, you would not be able to see how and when the attacker managed to gain access. And kubectl delete events all is a way to delete any notification or events history of the cluster itself, right? But you'd have to still go back and delete another log file within the Kubernetes environment for this to be truly truly erase all information. You launch pods in reserved namespaces to match other workloads, which is what we saw, right? And you hide origin IP addresses. This is more on from where the attacker is coming from, right? But the first three are direct actions that you can take within the cluster to ensure that you remain hidden. Okay, moving on to credential access. The techniques include listing Kubernetes secrets, mounting service principals, and if you notice, some of these techniques are repeated, right? So if you look at say under discovery, you have some of them that have been repeated earlier as well, right? Because at different parts of your attacker journey and different times of your attacker journey, you may want to revisit some of these techniques to gain additional access, right? So which is why they become applicable in multiple tactics. Credential access, listing Kubernetes secrets, mounting service principal, access container service account, application credentials and configuration files, 2 new ones that have been added, malicious admission controller, and access managed identity credentials. We'll take a look at container service account. I think I have only one of those. Take a look at me trying to start, or rather me gaining access to a pod and trying to make a request to the Kubernetes API server. I'm unauthorized there, but using the service account token, which we've seen multiple times now in the past, this is how you'd use it in the real world. You extract the service account token, you assign it to a variable, and then you pass it by the authorization bearer to your Kubernetes API server. Right? I'm using -- insecure simply because the cluster needs to verify the request that is coming from the DNS, the SSL certificate rather does not have Kubernetes as one of the names in the certificate chain, right? So -k or -- insecure would work for you, and now you see that you have access to the Kubernetes control plane, rather the API service. Most attackers will try and identify alternate regions, resources, and networks. I've seen attackers gain access to a pod, install Nmap, and then run a port scan on. And very valid technique, because regardless of whether it is Kubernetes or not, if you gain access to a service, if you gain access to a pod or an execution environment, you would want to see where you are, right? Essentially, who you are, where you are, and what else is accessible from here. To reach protected regions that may require credentials, some of the techniques that attackers do: Kubernetes secret store, using the service principal mounted on the node, which you saw as an example just now. Pod mounted container service account tokens. the application credentials in config maps, environment variables, malicious admission controllers, and cloud credentials to generate the kube config for the cluster. The last piece is really is a really cool technique in my opinion, especially because if you have a cluster that is running on top of a cloud environment, right? Cloud providers make it really easy for you, either via the UI or using command line interfaces. They make it really easy for you to administer the cluster without knowing a lot of Kubernetes internals. And they give you a UI where you can, create your pods. They give you a single point and click, kind of functionality where you can download the kube config for the cluster. Now imagine you are able to use the metadata instance or other things to gain access to the cloud credentials itself. You then use this cloud credentials back on the cluster to generate the kube config for the cluster as an administrator, right? In my opinion, you'll be hitting the door and then coming back and then kicking the door again. A pretty cool technique that way. For discovery as the next phase, the instance metadata API, which is what I keep talking about. And a lot of people underestimate the amount of information that the instance metadata API could leak. This is on Azure, and this one is on Google, right? The instance metadata API, you've seen a lot of usages for these when you're trying to do an SSRF in association with SSRF. If your attacker is familiar with this, when you're trying to build POCs for SSRF and if the machine is on the cloud, for maximum impact, you're going to try and extract the IAM credentials, the temporary token credentials that are attached to as an instance profile that are attached to the underlying machine, right? It's true for Azure and for Google Cloud as well as AWS. You would be able to use make a request to the instance metadata endpoint to extract temporary token and credentials. You can then use that to go ahead and escape into the cloud environment, right? What I have on screen here is me executing into the node access pod that we just created. And because I am in the pod now, I have access to the instance metadata endpoint that is running on the node, right? And this is unique per machine on the cloud. For Google and Azure, you require a metadata header. AWS has IMDS version 2 that requires a put request to be sent, extract a token, and pass the token again as a means of protecting against vanilla SSRS. You wouldn't be able to do this straight out of the box from an application vulnerability. But what you have here are information that is for the node, right? And if you look at in the next screen, we'll take a look at one of the endpoints where you can extract the token for a Google Cloud environment and see what we can do with it. In my opinion, this tactic, as I've said, is described too late in the threat matrix, although most attackers will have already performed a bunch of these additional discovery steps as soon as they gain access. Like imagine you've gained access to, in execution, you've gained access to a pod, right? I've seen a lot of attackers go and run, Nmap and other network mapping tools. They try to access the Kubernetes dashboard internally. They try and access the Kubernetes API. They access the the API server by extracting the service account token. So discovery is a little late in the chain, but specific in this context. If you look at discovery, you're trying to find out more, right? You're trying to figure out what additional resources I can go and hack and break into. Okay. The interesting thing with lateral movement, right? You are already in a pod. You are already within the cluster. You have already gained privileges. You've already gained access to additional credentials. Now you would want to move laterally to a different resource, right? And accessing the cloud resource is actually a vertical movement, in my opinion, because you're moving from the cluster environment to the cloud environment where you have a bunch of other resources that you can go attack. Given whatever access you've gained, you could simply reuse that access to perform additional things within the cloud. Let's take a look at if we can do something with this. Screenshots here. If you take a look at the top screenshot, you have a curl command that extracts the token, or rather queries the instance metadata to generate a GCP service account token for the service account that's mounted on the underlying host. The default token. This access token can then be used to query the storage Google API endpoint to look at what storage buckets are in place for that account. And do you see where the attack has reached now? The attacker started with being in a pod, gaining access to the host, and then using the service account token to gain access to another resource within the cloud. So you've essentially moved out of the cluster into the cloud environment. Now you have access to whatever else the token gives you access to within the cloud environment, right? And you don't have to run with storage Google API. I'll show you a simpler technique. Let me see if I have a screenshot of that somewhere. I actually have in under collection. When I reach there, I'll show you a screenshot for that. Lateral movement is used to capture techniques that can be used to move between resources, as we've rightfully seen. Accessing the internal networking of the cluster to see what other services are accessible, what else could be running within the environment. Sometimes services that are outside the cluster are visible within the cluster. Imagine you have an RDS that's hosted somewhere on the cloud, and then now you have access to the RDS through the cluster itself. A container that allows access to the host via volume host path bound can compromise all containers, right? And this is bad, especially if you're going to be hosting an environment that is multi-tenant in some way or the other, right? Which is why you can't create a pod on a node that is running on EKS. You can't create a pod with a host path mount and a privileged pod for that matter on something that's managed completely by the cloud provider. Right? Try it out on EKS or GK or AKS on Azure. Because being able to imagine, right? If you're able to escape the pod into the underlying host, right, on the underlying node, you then now have access to everything else that the node was hosting. And this could be the pods and containers of other customers within EKS, right, or Azure or GK, right? And Google actually pays a lot of bounty if you are able to do something like this, again access to some other tenant's data, right? AWS not so much, Azure as well. Azure and GK have decent bug bounties for trying to do this. The new tactic that got added, right, the collection tactic, is when images from a private registry are extracted because you can now access the token that the attacker was able to extract from the instance metadata, right? If you look at what I have here, and let me see if I can run this as a demo for you folks. Yep, I can. And there, use the font. So what I'm trying to essentially do is here is let me extract the token, dump this into a file. We have a file here. Okay, so I've written basically extracted the token using the curl command, pointing to the instance metadata, and extracting the service account default token, for example. And using this, I've written it to a file because, as I showed in a previous screenshot, where by gaining access to the token, you'd have to figure out the storage API and go to Google or storage.google APIs, and eventually, if you want to access other services within the cloud environment, you'd want to know what their the API endpoints are, right? And most attackers do not want this level of most attackers don't want this level of difficulty rather at this point in time to go beyond and identify other resources. Imagine you want to interact with virtual machines, for example. You have to go figure out what the compute API, Google APIs are, and then figure out what additional API calls are required to simply list say virtual machines, right? But using the access token written to a file, you could simply pass this to gcloud using the hyphen access token file. The gcloud has an option to interact with. Oh, okay. gcloud is present on the machine, but it's not in path. Let me just add this to path. Oh. Yeah. Right. So if you notice, I can run gcloud, all gcloud commands by passing the access token in a file. I don't now. I no longer need to go make API calls to whatever .google apis.com and go figure out what parameters need to be passed. Right, Gcloud will take care of all of that for me. As attackers, this is very useful. By looking at container images list, I noticed that there are two containers within this project that I have, Alcatraz isolation. Let me look at what tags they have, because as an attacker, I want to, now I'm in the phase of performing collection. Essentially, images from your private registry is what I'm trying to extract, right? Using this, I will then make a pull request, or sorry, not a pull request. I do a Docker pull to the container registry, which I've already done on this one before. I'll just show you the screenshot for this. Take a look at the bottom half of the screen where my mouse cursor is. Once the tags are identified, you can simply use Gcloud's Docker, and beautifully Docker's authentication is going to be taken care by Gcloud. Right? You don't have to do a Docker auth again, trying to figure out which endpoint or which repository and which images to pull, or how you can convert the access token into a Docker authentication, and none of that is required. Right? As an attacker, straight away, transparent Gcloud Docker access token file, because that's what you're using to work with Gcloud, and you can do a pull on the image. And this is pretty common for developers, but for attackers, this is really intuitive. Because they no longer are working with individual credentials, right? They can work with all of the cloud container cloud environment using an access file. Once you have the image locally, you can then go inspect the image, see if there are any hard-coded variables and things like that, or if your source code is baked into these images, you can then extract your source code, right? So you've essentially bypassed and gained access to the code, the source code of your organization. The last tactic is impact. We have data destruction, resource hijacking, and denial of service. This is self-explanatory mostly, because where is the attacker going with all of this? What is the attacker trying to do? Right? As I briefly touched upon at the beginning, attackers want to perform an action at the end. They want to destroy either data within the cluster, steal the data, or perform resource hijacking. Right? Resource hijacking is an interesting one, because the only way sometimes people realize that their resources have been hijacked is because the increase in the bills that they have. Right? Imagine you're $1,000 AWS bill every month, and then suddenly you receive a $10,000 bill because your AWS cluster, your EKS and your AWS environment was used to do crypto mining, right? Which is exactly what happened with Tesla a couple of years ago, where the Kubernetes dashboard was exposed, and using which in one of the secrets that is embedded within the Kubernetes cluster were the AWS credentials for an S3 bucket. Right, the attackers were able to use this to steal, rather download content in the bucket and use the dashboard itself to create additional containers that would perform crypto mining. Right, and if someone like Tesla's environments can get exposed, and this is from a real world screenshot, can get exposed. This is very difficult to, as I said, very difficult to identify from by inspecting or giving a cursory look at the cluster itself. You would want to know exactly what's running in which cluster, right? Which is why the health notifications around which CPUs have been utilized more. Or suddenly there's an additional node that was provisioned, or you have increase in the number of pods that are running within your environment. Hijacking resources to perform alternate tasks is a very commonly heard technique. As I said, altering any state within the cluster can result in a denial of service. Rolling back a deployment, for example, or simply removing a daemon set, or a removal of secrets to altering config maps, updating a network policy can cause the cluster to misbehave, right, and bringing down the services that were being exposed by the cluster to the public, and your businesses are going to get impacted. That's what impact is. I'll take a pause here, and we'll run another quick poll, Aditya, if you can get this up. Just so that we get a sense of what security problem are you as an audience most worried about right? And it's okay if you're actually attackers in the audience listening to this, but think of it from the standpoint of someone who's tasked with security, right, and mitigations, for example, in their environment. Operating system patches within my cloud instances usually taken care by the cloud provider, but sometimes you need to log in, do some patchwork. Most cloud providers give you the ability to deploy patches using services that they have. User role permissions, rogue users who may have left the organizations or were never part of the company in the first place. We've seen some of our customers that we've interacted with where they've had employees who've left the organization, but their accounts are still active. Security misconfigurations in my cloud services is kind of covers the whole umbrella of security flaws. Oh, and that seems to be 78% of folks in the audience are worried about security misconfigurations in cloud services. Excellent. You folks should really try signing up for Kloudle's free trial. We do this very well. Let's quickly jump into, we have a few minutes. Let's quickly jump into part 3. Some of the tips for cluster security, and not all of them align with real world defensive techniques that you are familiar with, but I'm looking at this from an attacker's perspective, right? Keep your Kubernetes updated, including core components, API, service, SCD, etc. Restrict your SSH access. I've seen a lot of folks open SSH to the world on their nodes, and use Kubernetes network policies. Only allow what is required within the cluster itself. Audit the roles and binding service accounts periodically. Take a look at shadow admins if they exist within your cluster. Scan images in your pipeline using tools like Trivy, for example, before they reach production, and you'll be able to identify if there's any library related or module related misconfigurations or vulnerabilities within your code. Remove deployments that are no longer required. Run pods with a security context. Always don't run pods with root. Use namespaces to create logical segregation of resources. Remember, namespaces are not hard separations for your tenants. And don't use namespaces as hard tenant separation. That's not true, because pods within namespaces can talk to each other. Do not store secrets in environment variables in pod description or config maps. Right. This tip is actually counterintuitive. Some people would want to store because it's easier for the image to read. I would prefer storing it in the vault of the cloud provider where your cluster is running. Ensure minimum visibility from the internet to your cluster. If your control plane is not required to be exposed to the internet, please do not have 6443 or 443, whatever port your cluster is going to be visible out of. Don't have that exposed to the internet. Make sure the application security is also taken into consideration. A lot of application security flaws can be used to reach the cluster and then move on to the cloud, as we saw. Use pod security admission controller version 1.22 and above of Kubernetes supports pod security. PSPs have been deprecated, right? So use pod security admission controller. That's the flag you need to pass to the API server to enable pod security admission. The beautiful articles on kubernetes.io to see how this can be done. Use a hardening guideline like CIS Kubernetes benchmark and tools like Kubebench to identify potential misconfigurations. Right, and plug here. Kloudle also supports Kubernetes on all major cloud platforms, including your AKS, GKS, EKS, as well as standalone, and can show you misconfigurations and limitations within minutes of being onboarded. Right. To close for today, we have Dilbert. I have some questions coming up on chat. I'll take those in a bit, and I see that we're at 3:30. We'll just take a couple of more minutes. One of my favorite Dilbert comics when it relates to technology, how technology is a solution for anything. Oh, we have another poll. Aditya, can you quickly run this? This is the last poll. Do you worry about getting hacked, getting affected by ransomware, data theft? Yes, no, not my area of responsibility. Some of you folks have answered no. I'm really interested to see who they are. Understand if it's not your area of responsibility. But looks like yes is the most obvious common answer here. I'll just take questions, some of them. Okay, the first question here is, I understand that we've reached the end of the time that we had blocked for this, but I'll just finish these two questions. If I have a workforce of 80 to 100 employees and I want them to work simultaneously using RDP, is a K cluster a better option, or should I work on classic individual machines? This is more a architecture question. Not very sure what would work for you, right? So not security related. So I wouldn't be able to give you a proper answer with this. Yes, the slides are going to be available. Actually, the recording will be available for all the folks who are on the presentation today here, and the folks who have registered as well, they'll get a link from Aditya. Can Kloudle find such secrets by scanning? I think I missed the context when the secrets thing came up. Kloudle can detect for Kubernetes, can identify what pods are within the cluster, can identify what nodes are within the cluster, and can identify misconfigurations are within the cluster, right? So if your secrets are part of your cluster, right, because Kloudle does not by design and by principle does not go and inspect your code, right? It kind of, there's a thin gray line between we looking at metadata for your cloud and we going and inspecting your secrets and your code head forward, right? So Kloudle will not identify secrets that are vulnerable, because that doesn't make sense. Secrets are going to be part of the cluster, but Kloudle can definitely tell you what secrets are present, not the actual secret itself, but the name of the secret and what pods and what they're aligned with. Some Kubernetes distributions like okay, this interface is new to me, so some Kubernetes distributions like okay, 2 is compliant Kubernetes. How are these systems secure by default? What kind of attacks or flaws can be observed from these systems? A very good question. If being CIS compliant does not mean that your cluster is going to be secure, right? As we saw at the beginning, the MITRE ATT&CK framework kind of takes care, shows you the techniques that are available for an attacker who's going to be looking at a hardened cluster also. But imagine if you have a vulnerable web application running on top of the CIS, so CIS approved benchmark cluster, your web application could allow for the attacker to gain access to the underlying pod, right? And from there to the underlying node. But yes, it's not a absolute foolproof thing, but it's definitely a best practice to have your cluster to be CIS benchmark approved, right? And this has nothing to do with CIS themselves. This is because the number of checks that they have is infinitely much more better than not having anything at all. Okay. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, Aditya will send out an email with this. Difference between Docker and Kubernetes. Docker is your container runtime, container Docker. These are the to put it simply, Docker will take your definition of what you want to run and run it, while Kubernetes is used to manage a bunch of these Docker containers running. Right? Think of Docker as the sheep, right? While Kubernetes as the person who's managing the sheep. Okay. I know that was a analogous example, but yes. Can we have a list of test cases for pen testing in cloud instances and Kubernetes clusters? List of test cases. This is a very open-ended question, but yes, if you take a look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and understand, go through the techniques again, and see that there are different kinds of attack techniques that the attacker could use, right? If you look at say, you can easily build your own test case for that matter. Take a look at say I have a cluster running and I don't know what ports are open. So running a port scan, for example, would be identifying what services are visible, right? Identifying if the service account token that is mounted within the cluster is privileged or not, right? Does it require that many privileges to run? Things like those could be used to build your test cases. But this is a very, it's a good question. It's a very, the answer is pretty expansive. Kind of hit on our time. Do take a look at the folks who are here. Do take a look at the academy, line number 2 on the page here. Kloudle.com/academy has a lot of articles we've written, a lot of content we've written, technical content, like pure technical content we've written, that you will be able to use in your day-to-day managing of, say, Kubernetes, or even your cloud instances for that matter. A lot of interesting work that we do around research and stuff. We post on our blog in the academy. Do take a look at that as well, please. Okay. I think we've kind of held back everybody 7 minutes beyond our time that we had with them. I think we can just close.
Thank you, sir. It was a very insightful session.
Yeah.
Like, people kept asking for the recording and
Yeah.
everything. So yes, the recording will be available by Monday or Tuesday on E2E Network's YouTube page. And I'll mail each one of you the link to the recording also. And thanks everyone for attending this session. And thank you, sir, for your time and thoughts and knowledge. I hope everyone had an excellent time and is leaving with valuable insight. I would like to let you know that E2E's Kubernetes as a service is also available on E2E Cloud, and you can contact us for your free trial. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you. All of you folks have a good day ahead. Bye-bye.